Hello, everyone. This lesson is aims to make a short overview of what a longitudinal standee is. A longitudinal standee is a type of research design that involves collecting data from the same individuals over an extended period of time. It is often used to examine changes in behavior, attitudes, or health outcomes over time. Unlike cross-sectional studies, which collect the data at a single point in time, longitudinal studies allow researchers to track changes in individuals over time and to examine how these changes are related to other factors. For example, a longitudinal study could follow a group of people over the course of several years to see how their physical activity levels change and whether those changes are related to changes in their overall health. There are several types of longitudinal studies, including cohort studies, panel studies, and trend studies, among others. In a cohort study, a group of individuals is followed over time with data collected at multiple points along the way. In a panel study, a group of individuals is surveyed at multiple points in time with the same questions asked each time. In a trend study, data is collected from different groups of people at different points in time, allowing researchers to examine changes in the population as a whole. Longitudinal studies can provide valuable information about how individuals change over time and what factors contribute to those changes. However, they can also be time consuming and expensive to conduct and may suffer from issues such as attrition, people dropping out of the study over time, or measurement error, changes in the way data is collected or measured over time. The concept of longitudinal studies has been around for quite some time, although the specific terminology and methods have evolved over the years. One of the earliest examples of a longitudinal study was the Framingham Heart Study, which began in 1948, continues up to date, and this study has followed generations of participants in the town of Framingham, Massachusetts, and has contributed a wealth of knowledge about the risk factors for heart disease and other health outcomes. Another study example of a longitudinal study was the Berkeley Growth Study, which began in the 1920s and followed a group of children over the course of several decades to study their physical and psychological development. However, it wasn't until the mid 20th century that longitudinal studies became more widely used in research. In the 1950s and 1960s, researchers began to recognize the importance of studying individuals over time to better understand the complex interplay between biological, social, and environmental factors that shape human development and health. Since then, longitudinal studies have become increasingly common in a wider range of fields, from psychology and sociology to medicine and public health. And today, they are widely recognized as a powerful tool for understanding how people change and develop over time, and for identifying the factors that contribute to those changes. Some of the earliest examples in the field of longitudinal studies date back to the 19th century. One notable early example is the work of British epidemiologist William Farr, who in the 1850s used longitudinal data to investigate patterns of mortality in England and Wales. Of course, it wasn't until the mid 20th century that longitudinal studies became more widely used and recognized as a distinct research method. One of the pioneers, however, in this area was American psychologist Paul Lazarsfeld, who in the 1940s and 50s conducted several influential longitudinal studies examining social and political attitudes. Another notable figure in the development of longitudinal studies was American sociologist Robert Nisbet, who in the 1950s and 1960s conducted a series of panel studies examining changes in attitudes and values over time, and his work helped to establish the value of longitudinal data for understanding social change. Since then, longitudinal studies have become increasingly common across many fields of research. Some of the other researchers who have conducted important longitudinal studies on the topic now of birth trauma over the lifespan are David Olds. Olds is an American pediatrician and researcher who is best known for his work on the Nurse Family Partnership Program, a home visiting program for low income, first time mothers. And his longitudinal studies have shown that the program can improve outcomes for both mothers and children, including reducing rates of preterm birth and child maltreatment. Another duet, Klaus and Kennel. They are American pediatricians who conducted a landmark study in the 1970s on the effects of early mother-infant contact on maternal and infant outcomes. The study found that early contact can reduce stress and promote bonding, and has since been replicated in other studies. Another study is that of Brazy and colleagues. Brazy and colleagues are a group of American researchers who have conducted several longitudinal studies on the effects of birth trauma on premature infants. These studies have shown that premature infants who experience birth trauma are at increased risk for developmental delays and neurobehavioral problems later in life. Then we have Samantha Melcher Brody, an American psychiatrist who has conducted several longitudinal studies on the effects of perinatal mood disorders on maternal and child outcomes. And her studies have shown that perinatal depression and anxiety can have long lasting effects on child development and mental health. Then we have Martin Taker, an American neuroscientist who has conducted longitudinal studies on the effects of childhood trauma, including birth trauma, on brain development and mental health outcomes later in life. Michael Lewis, an American psychologist who has conducted longitudinal studies on the effects of early attachment experiences, including those related to birth trauma, on child development and mental health. Judith Lumley. Lumley is an Australian midwife and researcher who has conducted longitudinal studies on the effects of birth interventions, including cesarean section and induction of labor, on maternal and child outcomes. Mariana Braja Zganec. Perhaps my pronunciation is not correct, so apologies to the lady. The Croatian psychologist who has conducted longitudinal studies on the effects of perinatal stress on maternal mental health and child development. There are many others who have made important contributions to our understanding of birth trauma over the lifespan through the longitudinal studies, highlighting the importance of this research method in exploring the long term effects of early life experiences on health and well being. There are several trends that are emerging today. Some of them are there is an increased focus on the impact of birth trauma on maternal mental health. There is a growing recognition that birth trauma can have long lasting effects on maternal mental health, including increased the risk of postpartum depression, anxiety, and post traumatic stress disorder (PTSD). Longitudinal studies are being conducted to better understand the factors that contribute to these outcomes and to identify effective interventions. Another trend is the use of advanced imaging techniques to study brain development. Advances in brain imaging techniques such as magnetic resonance imaging (MRI) and functional MRI are allowing researchers to study the effects of birth trauma on brain development in greater detail, and longitudinal studies are being conducted to track changes in brain structure and function over time and to identify biomarkers that may predict long-term outcomes. There is also a focus on the role of social support. And longitudinal studies are increasingly exploring the role of social support in mitigating the effects of birth trauma on maternal and child outcomes. And these studies are examining the impact of interventions such as peer support, home visiting programs, group therapy on maternal mental health, and to child development. There is also an incorporation of diverse populations. Longitudinal studies tend to be increasingly including diverse populations in their samples, including women from different racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic backgrounds. And this is important for understanding how experiences of birth trauma and its long term effects may vary across different groups. Overall, longitudinal studies on birth trauma are advancing our understanding of the long term effects of early life experiences on health and well being. By continuing to explore these trends, researchers can develop more effective interventions to prevent and mitigate the impact of birth trauma on maternal and child outcomes. And there is a huge gap that hopefully will do something in the near future, trying to see how the prenatal and the perinatal trauma affects the person in gestation, being born, and then living with us.